For those of you that don't know me, I'm Groove Slick. And for those of you that do know me, I'm still Groove Slick. For the past few seasons, I have been tirelessly working on perfecting the art of driving the Porsche Cup car on iRacing.
No, come on. Damn it.
Or at least the art of crashing. But with each pass, mistake, and win, I've been learning and adapting my driving style. In this series, I will be sharing with you all that I've learned, so hopefully you can get to the winning and skip some of the crashing. For those of you that aren't familiar with this series, it is an emulation of the Porsche Cup series that spanned the globe and the odd but lovable younger brother to the iRacing Esports Super Cup, whose $200,000 prize package has attracted some of the best esports drivers. This talent level trickles down to the lower series, which is still ultra competitive. And on top of that, without any ABS, the car is ultra challenging on the brakes as well.
Shit. Oh my god.
So being fast requires high levels of dedication and attention to detail. So in the next few episodes of Data Download, I'll be helping to shed some light on the most challenging aspect of driving the Porsche Cup car, the braking. We will discuss theory and techniques, starting with initial application, then covering trail braking, downshifting, and brake bias in subsequent videos. In this episode, we will cover the initial application, where we transition from full throttle to peak brake pressure. This may seem simple on the surface, but if you apply the brakes too slowly, you will give up tenths in every braking zone, which can add up to seconds per lap. And if you're too aggressive, you will lock up, causing you to slide off the track, or worse yet, to hit the wall. Since this topic can get very complicated very quickly, we will start with the most simple case of braking in a straight line from high speed. We broach this topic by first discussing how weight transfers when you apply the brakes and what this means for tire grip. We will then take a look at how to apply this knowledge by comparing how two separate drivers apply the brakes at turn 1 at VIR, a heavy braking zone where we decelerate from 160 miles an hour to 50 miles an hour in just over 5 seconds. If you feel that these are concepts or techniques that you've already mastered, we will be ratcheting up the complexity in the next few videos and discussing more and more advanced techniques. Since this is my first episode about braking, I feel like I have to mention hardware, because although it won't make you a better driver, it can make your life significantly easier. So let me just briefly discuss potentiometer-based brake pedals versus load cell brake pedals. Here we have a potentiometer-based brake pedal. It is angle dependent, so the further we push the pedal, the harder the brakes are applied. Let's do a quick demo. Wait. I don't use racing shoes. Okay, that's better. Here, the angle that the brake pedal makes relative to the rest position determines the braking force. With a load cell pedal, as the name suggests, the braking force depends on the load that we apply to the pedal, or how hard we push the brake pedal. These brakes usually have much harder springs and dampers, thus very little movement. Since the force we apply to a load cell pedal is much higher, it is easy to adjust the braking force by simply pressing slightly harder or slightly less hard. With a potentiometer-based brake pedal, these adjustments are more challenging since it is not so easy to discern the angle of a brake pedal. Thus, we can be quicker and more precise with a load cell pedal, but it also takes more effort. So, if you're looking for an edge in the braking zones and don't already have one, I recommend getting either a set of load cell pedals or an aftermarket load cell upgrade kit. Now to the fun stuff, where we'll analyze how a guest driver and myself apply the brakes going into turn 1 at VIR, and what we can do to decrease the time spent braking and thus maximize our lap time. To understand this further, let's look at what happens to the car when we go from full throttle to peak brake pressure. Here, we have a side view of the Cup car. This will give us a good chance to see how the angle that the car makes relative to the ground, otherwise known as the rake, changes during brake application. We'll start out on full throttle. As we lift off, the angle changes and the car tilts forward. When we apply the brakes, the car then tilts even further forward. Let's put the car on scales to see how this changes the weight on each tire. The scales now show us that when we lift off, we are in effect putting more weight on the front tires and less weight on the rear tires. And as expected, applying the brakes simply increases this weight transfer. This matters because the tire grip, or friction force, for those of you that took physics course in college, depends on how much weight is on each tire. What this means is, as we decelerate, the front end gains grip and the rear end loses grip. But it's a little more complicated than that. So let's take an overhead view and see what happens with each tire. Each of these boxes represents how much grip a tire has available to do things like accelerate, turn, or brake. As we already know, when we lift off the throttle, the front tires gain grip and the rear tires lose grip. And then, when we apply the brakes, this effect is further exaggerated. But as you can see, a significant portion of grip is now being used to slow the car down. And as a side note, we can actually change how much front or rear grip is used by changing the brake bias. When the brake bias is further forward, more front grip is used, and when the brake bias is further rearward, more rear grip is used. But more on this in a later video. Going back to where we were, we continue applying the brakes until we're just about out of grip, either at the front or the rear, depending upon car setup. This point will be our peak brake pressure. If we push the brakes any harder, the front or rears will lock up and we will begin to slide. So our goal in this phase of braking is to apply the brakes as quickly as we can to peak pressure where the car is just about to start sliding without going over the limit. So let's compare how a guest driver and myself apply the brakes to see these concepts in action. Because the braking zone goes by so quickly, starting here with the data will give us a much clearer understanding of what's going on, and then we can go to the onboard video afterwards. Now, for those of you that aren't as familiar with these squiggly lines we call telemetry, I have a video linked in the top right corner that should help you understand this. So my data traces are the purple lines here. I am becoming a more experienced Porsche Cup driver. As I said, I've been racing for a couple seasons now. The Pro qualifying series just concluded, and I was about 1.5 to 2 seconds off of the people racing in that series. And our guest drivers data is in the yellow. They're relatively new to the Porsche Cup car, about 1.2 seconds off my time. So definitely not a rookie by any means, but looking at the data, I can see some things that we can definitely home in on to help them get faster. So we'll start by looking at the brake application for turn 1. And so the throttle trace is on bottom here and the brake trace is the middle lines here. And even though the brake application won't save you very much time-wise over the course of a lap, I think it's a good place for us to start because in my mind it sets the tone for the braking zone and it shows how comfortable you are in a car. So what I mean by that is if you feel confident in the car, you can hit the brakes hard and know that it'll be there to support you, and then you bring that confidence all the way through the braking zone. If you're kind of timid getting onto the brake pedal, it shows you don't really have that confidence built up yet, and then you'll be losing time throughout that entire braking zone. And that's kind of what's happening with the guest driver here. So if we look at my brake trace first, we see that I come off the throttle cleanly and I have one continuous firm press of the brake. Basically a constant line of increasing force all the way to my peak pressure. With our guest driver, we actually see there's kind of 2 phases to this braking. There's the initial application where they have a firm press that looks very similar to mine, and then the secondary phase that lasts much longer where they gradually increase their brake pressure. And what this tells me is that they don't have the confidence that the car will actually be able to support them through the braking zone. They're probably pretty worried that either the front or the rear tires are going to lock up, and they don't have the confidence in knowing what that peak pressure really should be. What you can do to build up this confidence is first of all recognize that you're doing this, and second of all, if you spend an entire hour-long practice, just every time you go into a braking zone thinking, okay, I'm going to press the brakes firmly, I'm going to press the brakes firmly, and hitting that peak pressure off of that initial push, that will really go a long way in giving you confidence on the brakes and helping you to clean up this phase of your braking. As I mentioned, the first phase of this braking goes by very quickly, so it is hard to glean a lot of information from these onboard videos, but there are 2 quick things that I want to show you. The first is, as we enter this braking zone, I want you to notice I have a couple degrees of steering input. We see that as I start to apply the brakes, the steering input goes to 0. It's really important in these heavy braking zones that you brake in a straight line. So that's the first thing I want to mention. And the second is, as I reach this peak pressure, we see, if you look at these 2 little LEDs at the bottom of my dashboard, they're telling me that the rear brakes are locking up. Not a lot, but they are slightly sliding. So what this tells me is maybe I've asked just a slight bit too much from the brakes in this car and have been slightly too aggressive on the pedal. And that's something that I can work on in the future, is maybe taking it down 1% or 2 to try to keep those rear brakes from locking and give myself more performance in the braking zone. Now, if we look at our guests, it looks almost identical to mine. The steering wheel goes straight just as they apply the brakes, except, as we can see here, they do not have that initial lockup in the rear that I did. So again, that tells us that they're not quite as confident in asking as much from the car as I am, but again, on the flip side, maybe I just asked a bit too much. So my first takeaway is to apply the brakes with one smooth, continuous application. If you don't, you'll be giving up time early on in the braking zone and increasing your braking distance. And the second takeaway is use these LED lights on your dashboard to determine your peak brake pressure and thus your peak tire grip. If you never notice these lights on the initial phase of your braking, it probably means you're well below the grip limit and you're not asking enough from the car in the braking zone. This means that you're not reaching your peak brake potential and you're giving up time all the way through the braking zone. The flip side of this is, if you're always noticing those lights on the initial phase of your braking, you might want to peel off a percent or two from your peak brake pressure to make sure you're not sliding on the initial phase of braking and also losing grip and braking distance. So those are my main takeaways, but I'd love to hear what you think, and I'd also like to hear if there's any topics you'd like me to cover in the future. Now, if you made it this far, you either found this video interesting and helpful, or you fell asleep within the first few seconds. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I'm planning on releasing more of these videos in the future, and I'll be doing some live streams as well, so keep an eye out for those. They might make for some good bedtime listening. Anyways, thanks again. I'll see you next time.